I guess I always had this gut feeling that something wasn't right between me and Sarah. We'd been married for 6 years, and from the outside, it probably looked like we had it all: a nice house, 2 kids, and a stable, if somewhat predictable, suburban life. But inside, things had been feeling off. It wasn't always like this. There were days when I couldn't wait to come home to her smile, when we'd spend hours laughing over nothing. Somewhere along the line, though, those moments had faded. I don't know when exactly it started, but the signs were there if I think about it now. Sarah used to be affectionate, always the one to pull me in for a hug or brush her fingers against mine just because. Lately, though, she'd become distant. She wasn't outright cold, she'd still ask how my day was or smile when I made a dumb joke, but it felt more like she was going through the motions than actually present with me. There were other things, too. She started spending more time on her phone. At first, I didn't think much of it, everyone scrolls through social media or texts friends these days. But she started taking her phone with her everywhere, into the bathroom, outside on the porch, even when she was just grabbing a drink from the fridge. When I'd ask who she was texting, she'd brush it off with a quick, "Oh, just Megan," or, "Work stuff, nothing interesting." It's funny how the little things can gnaw at you when you're already feeling unsure. The late nights working overtime, the sudden urge to dress up more often, the moments when she'd zone out like her mind was somewhere else. I tried convincing myself it was just stress or that maybe I was reading too much into things. But deep down, I knew something had shifted between us. I'd been telling myself for weeks that everything was fine, that we were just in a rough patch like all couples go through. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening right under my nose. I had no idea just how right I was, or how much it was about to shatter the world I thought I knew. It was a Saturday afternoon, one of those rare weekends when neither of us had any pressing plans. The kids were playing in the backyard, their laughter echoing through the house, while I sat at the kitchen table trying to sort through some bills. Sarah was upstairs, cleaning the bedroom, which, in retrospect, was her way of getting some alone time. Nothing felt unusual about the day, at least, not at first. I was rummaging through the drawer where we kept receipts when I came across Sarah's old tablet. She hadn't used it in years, but it still worked as a backup device for the family. I figured it might have a few apps or accounts still logged in that I could use to check something online. The moment I powered it on, though, I saw the notifications. A string of text messages popped up on the lock screen, and I froze. The messages weren't from Megan, her coworker, or anyone else I recognized. They were from someone named Jay. A quick glance at the previewed messages told me everything I didn't want to know. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. Red heart, I keep thinking about the way you looked, do you think he suspects anything?" My stomach dropped. It felt like the ground had just disappeared beneath me, and I was free-falling into some endless void. My first instinct was to put the tablet down, to pretend I hadn't seen it. Maybe I could convince myself it wasn't what it looked like. But curiosity, or maybe it was the need for confirmation, won out. My hands trembled as I unlocked the device. Her password hadn't changed in years, and it felt ironic how much I trusted her that I never thought she'd bother hiding anything from me. Once inside, the text thread painted a picture I didn't want to see. Their messages were a mix of flirty banter, intimate confessions, and explicit details about encounters they'd had. I couldn't believe it. Sarah, my wife, the person I trusted more than anyone else, had been seeing someone behind my back. And judging by the messages, it wasn't just a fleeting mistake, this had been going on for weeks, maybe months. I kept scrolling, even though each word cut deeper than the last. The messages referenced times when I thought she was working late or out with friends. The worst part was realizing how easily she'd lied to me, how effortlessly she'd carried on this double life while I sat at home oblivious. I saw pictures, too, ones she'd sent him that I'd never seen before. Intimate, personal moments she'd shared with someone else. I didn't even notice how hard I was gripping the tablet until my fingers started to ache. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. The sound of the kids' laughter outside brought me back to reality. I closed the messages and set the tablet down, staring at it like it might explode. What was I supposed to do now? My mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Who was this guy? Did she love him? Did she still love me? The thought that she might have chosen someone else over me, that she might have been doing this while looking me in the eye every day, was unbearable. I didn't confront her immediately. I needed time to process what I'd just seen. My first instinct was to storm upstairs and demand answers, but I knew that wouldn't help. Instead, I sat there at the kitchen table, staring at the tablet and replaying every interaction we'd had over the past few months. Suddenly, all the little signs I'd ignored came rushing back: the phone glued to her hand, the increased work hours, the sudden effort to dress up even when she was supposedly just running errands. For hours, I felt paralyzed, caught between anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. This wasn't just about the betrayal, it was about everything it represented. The life we'd built together, the promises we'd made, the trust I'd put in her, all of it felt like a lie. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was staring me in the face. That night, I decided to keep quiet. I didn't say anything when she came downstairs, smiling like everything was normal. I didn't say anything when we ate dinner together, surrounded by the laughter of our kids. But I knew this was the beginning of the end. I couldn't pretend anymore, and soon enough, she'd know that, too. It didn't take long for my silence to crack. By the next evening, I was a mess of pent-up anger, hurt, and questions that refused to leave my mind. Sarah noticed, of course. She kept asking if I was okay, and I'd just brush her off with a short, "I'm fine." But I wasn't fine, not even close. I could barely look at her without feeling the sting of betrayal. Every smile, every casual touch, every moment she acted like everything was normal only made it worse. By the time the kids were asleep, I couldn't hold it in anymore. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone like she always did, and I stood there, watching her for what felt like forever. I think part of me was hoping she'd notice the storm brewing inside me, that she'd look up and see that something was wrong. But she didn't. She just sat there, completely unaware, and I finally snapped. "Who the hell is Jay?" I asked, my voice sharp and louder than I intended. Her head shot up, and for a second, she looked genuinely confused. But then I saw it, the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the way her face paled ever so slightly. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "Don't lie to me, Sarah," I said, my voice shaking now. "I saw the messages. I know everything." She stared at me, her lips pressing into a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might try to deny it. But instead, she sighed, put her phone down, and buried her face in her hands. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she finally said, her voice muffled. "Find out like this?" I repeated, incredulous. "What does that even mean, Sarah? You've been cheating on me, and you're worried about how I found out." "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said, looking up at me with tears in her eyes. It just happened, okay?" I felt my anger flare. "It just happened. Are you serious right now? Affairs don't just happen, Sarah. You don't accidentally send texts like the ones I saw. You don't accidentally sleep with someone else." Her tears started falling, but I didn't care. I was too angry, too hurt to feel any sympathy. "I've been so unhappy," she said, her voice breaking. "I felt like we were just existing. Like we were roommates instead of a couple. And then he came along, and he made me feel alive again. I know it's wrong, but..." "But what?" I cut her off. You thought that was a good excuse to blow up our marriage. To lie to me. To destroy everything we've built together. She didn't answer, just looked down at her hands like a scolded child. The silence between us was deafening. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain I was feeling. But instead, I just stood there, my chest heaving as I tried to control my breathing. Do you even love me anymore? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated. That hesitation was like a dagger to the heart. I don't know, she admitted. I don't know if I've loved you the way I should for a long time. Her words hit me harder than anything else she could have said. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but what was the point? She'd already said it all. I turned away, unable to look at her anymore. I can't do this right now, I said, my voice trembling. I need some space. Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my keys and left the house. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay there a second longer. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, and I drove aimlessly for hours, replaying the conversation over and over in my head. Her words haunted me, I don't know if I've loved you the way I should. How do you come back from something like that? Could you even come back? I didn't have any answers, but one thing was clear, I couldn't pretend anymore. Everything had changed, and there was no going back. When I finally pulled back into the driveway, it was well past midnight. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the porch light, and for a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, unsure if I could even walk back inside. The thought of seeing Sarah, of facing the ruins of everything I thought we had, was almost unbearable. But I didn't have anywhere else to go. As soon as I stepped inside, the silence hit me. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the weight of everything that had happened. The house didn't feel like home anymore, it felt like a place where trust had been shattered. I saw Sarah's shadow in the living room, curled up on the couch, but I didn't say anything. I just walked upstairs, closed the bedroom door, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. That's when it all hit me. The anger, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it all came crashing down at once. My chest tightened, and I felt tears streaming down my face before I even realized I was crying. I hadn't cried in years, not even when my dad passed away, but this broke me. I kept replaying her words in my head. I don't know if I've loved you the way I should. How long had she felt that way? How long had I been living in a one-sided marriage, blind to the fact that my wife didn't feel the same way about me anymore? It was like everything I thought I knew about my life had been a lie. The worst part wasn't even the affair itself, it was the realization that she hadn't chosen me. In those moments when she was looking for something, someone to fill whatever void she felt, I wasn't enough. That thought ate away at me, leaving this gnawing sense of inadequacy that I couldn't shake. The next few days were a blur. Sarah and I barely spoke. She kept trying to approach me, her eyes red and puffy from crying, but I couldn't bring myself to engage. Every time I looked at her, all I could see were the messages, the betrayal, the lies. It felt like there was this invisible wall between us, and neither of us knew how to tear it down. I didn't tell anyone at first. I was too ashamed, too humiliated to admit what was going on. How do you explain to someone that your wife, the person you trusted more than anyone else in the world, had been cheating on you? That you'd been so blind, so naive, you didn't even see it coming? The thought of saying it out loud made it feel too real, like it was some irreversible stain on my life. But the emotions didn't stay bottled up for long. I was angry, angrier than I'd ever been in my life. Angry at Sarah for what she'd done, angry at the other guy for intruding on my family, angry at myself for not seeing the signs sooner. That anger spilled out in small ways, snapping at the kids over nothing, slamming doors, spending hours at the gym trying to burn it out of my system. But no matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't go away. It was like this constant fire burning inside me, and I didn't know how to put it out. And then there was the sadness. The overwhelming, suffocating sadness that came in waves, leaving me feeling hollow and drained. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the moments we'd shared, our wedding day, the birth of our kids, the quiet nights we used to spend watching movies on the couch. Were those memories even real? Or had she been faking it all along? The worst nights were the ones where I'd dream about her. In my dreams, everything was normal. We were happy, laughing, holding hands like nothing had ever gone wrong. And then I'd wake up and remember the truth, and it felt like losing her all over again. I didn't know how to move forward. Part of me wanted to fight for our marriage, to try to fix what was broken and find a way back to each other. But another part of me, the part that had been so deeply wounded, didn't know if I could ever trust her again. How do you rebuild something when the foundation has been completely destroyed? One night, a few days after the confrontation, Sarah came into the bedroom. I was sitting on the bed, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, trying to avoid thinking about anything too real. She sat down next to me, hesitating like she wasn't sure if she was welcome. "I know I've hurt you," she said softly. Her voice cracked, and I could tell she'd been crying again. "And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. The words were there, caught in my throat, but I couldn't push them out. Finally, I said, "Why, Sarah? Why did you do it?" She wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. "I don't have a good answer," she admitted. "I was selfish. I was unhappy, and instead of talking to you, I took the easy way out. I let myself believe that what I was doing was okay because it made me feel good. But it wasn't okay. I know that now." Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret, but they didn't make me feel any better. They didn't erase the pain or the betrayal or the gaping hole in my chest where my trust used to be. "I need time," I finally said. It was the only thing I could say. "I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but I need time to figure it out." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something other than anger. It wasn't forgiveness, nowhere near it, but it was the smallest step toward trying to understand. Time. That was all I'd asked for, but it turned out to be one of the hardest things to navigate. In the days that followed, my life felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. Every routine, every small moment, was shadowed by the knowledge of what had happened. I couldn't escape it. The betrayal seeped into everything: conversations with Sarah, my time with the kids, even my own thoughts. It was like a crack had formed in my reality, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore it. Sarah and I moved through the house like strangers. We spoke only when necessary, about the kids, the bills, the logistics of daily life, but every word felt loaded, every interaction forced. She was trying, I could see that. She'd go out of her way to ask how I was doing, to offer small gestures like cooking my favorite meals or leaving notes on the counter with apologies scribbled in the margins. But none of it reached me. It all felt hollow, like trying to patch a sinking ship with tape. The kids, bless them, had no idea what was going on. They were young, too young to understand the tension in the air or the way their parents avoided eye contact. But their innocence made it harder for me. Every time I looked at them, I wondered how this would affect them if things fell apart. Would they blame me? Would they blame her? Would they even understand? The thought of hurting them weighed on me more than anything else. One night, I found myself sitting on the couch after everyone had gone to bed. The house was quiet, but my mind was anything but. I kept replaying the past few months, trying to make sense of it all. Had there been signs I missed? Could I have done something to stop this? The questions circled endlessly, and no matter how many times I turned them over, I couldn't find any answers that gave me peace. I decided to distract myself and opened my laptop. For a while, I just scrolled aimlessly through social media, but then, almost without thinking, I typed his name into the search bar, Jason. That was the name from the messages. The man Sarah had been seeing. I hadn't dared to ask her much about him, but I knew enough to find him. And there he was, a profile with a smug smile staring back at me. Jason wasn't anything special. He wasn't some Adonis or billionaire or whatever fantasy I'd conjured in my head to justify why Sarah might have been drawn to him. He was just, normal. Average, even. That somehow made it worse. He was a teacher at a nearby school, a father, someone I might have run into at the grocery store or a school event. The thought of him stepping into my life, inserting himself into my marriage, made my blood boil. Against my better judgment, I clicked through his photos. Each one felt like a punch to the gut. There were pictures of him with his kids, smiling with a carefree ease that felt like mockery. There was nothing overtly incriminating, nothing that screamed affair, but just knowing what I knew made it impossible to see him as anything but an intruder. I wanted to hate him, to blame him for everything, but deep down, I knew he wasn't the only one at fault. Sarah had made the choice. She'd let him into her life, into our life. Still, staring at his face made my anger bubble to the surface. I wanted to confront him, to demand answers, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused me. But what would that accomplish? He wasn't the one I needed answers from. That responsibility fell squarely on Sarah. I slammed the laptop shut and leaned back, rubbing my hands over my face. I felt like I was unraveling, like every emotion I'd been suppressing was threatening to burst out all at once. Anger, sadness, confusion, they all swirled together, leaving me raw and exhausted. The next day, I made a decision. I needed to talk to someone outside of this mess who could offer a fresh perspective. I called my brother, Mike. We weren't as close as we used to be, but he'd always been someone I could count on in tough times. When I told him I needed to talk, he didn't hesitate. We met at a local bar that night. I hadn't planned on telling him everything, but the moment we sat down, it all spilled out. The affair, the confrontation, the way my life felt like it was crumbling beneath me, I laid it all out, piece by piece, like I was trying to make sense of it by saying it out loud. Mike listened without interrupting, his expression shifting between shock and anger. When I finally finished, he let out a long breath and shook his head. Jesus, man. I don't even know what to say. Me neither, I admitted. I feel like I'm stuck. Like no matter what I do, it's the wrong choice. He took a sip of his beer and leaned back, his brow furrowed in thought. Look, I'm not gonna tell you what to do. This is your marriage, your life. But one thing's for sure, you can't keep this bottled up. Whether it's with Sarah, a therapist, whatever, you've got to figure out what you want and start working toward it. Otherwise, this is just gonna eat you alive. His words hit me harder than I expected. He was right. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, letting the betrayal define every moment of my life. I needed to decide what I wanted, whether that meant trying to fix things with Sarah or walking away for good. Either way, I couldn't keep running from it. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a silent promise to myself, no more avoidance, no more excuses. The time for waiting was over. It was time to face the reality of what my life had become and start figuring out how to rebuild it, whether with Sarah or without her. The morning after my talk with Mike, I woke up feeling different. The weight in my chest was still there, but it felt, lighter somehow, like I'd finally given myself permission to face the storm head-on instead of letting it swallow me whole. I knew what I had to do. If I was going to get through this, I needed clarity, not just about what Sarah had done, but about what I wanted and who I wanted to be moving forward. I started with the basics. The first step was figuring out whether I could even begin to have a real conversation with Sarah about what had happened. It wasn't going to be easy, but ignoring the issue wasn't an option anymore. That morning, I found her in the kitchen, sipping her coffee and scrolling on her phone like it was any other day. For a second, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to retreat, to avoid the conversation altogether, but I pushed through it. "Sarah," I said, and my voice was firm enough that she immediately looked up. Her expression shifted, softening as if she already knew this wasn't going to be a casual talk. "We need to talk." She nodded, setting her mug down. "I know," she said quietly. "I've been waiting for you to be ready." The two of us sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared countless meals and conversations over the years, but this time, it felt like neutral ground in a war zone. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands fidgeted with the edge of her sweater. It was the same way I felt, on edge, unsure of what was going to happen next. "I need to know everything," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "If there's any hope of us moving forward, I need honesty. Total honesty." She nodded again, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Okay," she said after a long pause. "What do you want to know?" "Start from the beginning," I said. "How long has this been going on? How did it even start?" She took a deep breath and looked down at the table, avoiding my eyes. "It started about 6 months ago," she admitted. "We met at a work event. He's a teacher at one of the schools we partner with. At first, it was just casual, friendly conversations, nothing more. But then it turned into texting. And then, it turned into something else." Her voice trailed off, and I felt my stomach twist. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of her sneaking around behind my back while I was completely clueless. Did you love him?" I asked, hating myself for even needing to know. She shook her head quickly. "No," she said, her voice firm. "It wasn't love. It was. I don't know what it was. A distraction, maybe. An escape. But it was never love." "Did you think about me?" I asked, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to stay composed. "Did you ever stop to think about what this would do to me? To our family?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and for the first time, I saw something that looked like genuine regret. "I thought about it every day," she said, her voice trembling. "And every day, I told myself I'd stop. But I didn't. I was selfish, and I was weak. And I hate myself for it." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to lash out, to scream at her for the pain she'd caused, but another part of me, the part that still remembered the woman I'd fallen in love with, wanted to believe her. To believe that she really did regret what she'd done. After what felt like an eternity, I finally spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said honestly. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust you again. But I also don't know if I'm ready to give up on us." Her breath hitched, and she looked at me with a mix of hope and despair. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said. "Therapy, counseling, anything. I just want to fix this. I want to fix us." Her words were earnest, but I knew this wasn't something that could be fixed overnight, or maybe ever. Still, I had to start somewhere, and for now, that meant taking it one step at a time. "I need space," I said. "I need time to figure out what I want. And if we're going to even try to make this work, you need to prove to me that you're committed to rebuilding this. It's going to take more than words, Sarah." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand," she said softly. "And I'll do whatever it takes." As the conversation ended, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, anger, and a tiny spark of hope. It wasn't closure, not by a long shot, but it was the first step toward figuring out what came next. Later that day, I booked a therapy session for myself. I knew I needed help sorting through my own emotions before I could make any decisions about our future. If nothing else, I owed it to myself, and to my kids, to make sure I was in the right headspace to move forward, whatever that looked like. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was starting to regain a sliver of control over my life. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The first therapy session was harder than I expected. I walked into the room feeling skeptical, unsure of what to say or even where to start. But the moment I sat down across from Dr. Keller, a soft-spoken woman with kind eyes, it all came pouring out. I told her everything, the affair, the confrontation, the conversations Sarah and I had since. I talked about the anger that consumed me, the sadness that weighed me down, and the constant tug-of-war between wanting to fight for my marriage and wanting to walk away. By the end of the session, I felt emotionally drained, but for the first time in weeks, I also felt heard. Dr. Keller didn't give me easy answers, she told me there weren't any. But she helped me start untangling the mess in my head. "What do you want for yourself?" she asked near the end of the session. "Not for Sarah, not for the kids, for you." The question caught me off guard. I'd been so consumed by Sarah's betrayal and the fallout from it that I hadn't stopped to think about myself. What did I want? Did I even know anymore? When I got home, Sarah was in the living room, tidying up. She looked up when I walked in, her expression cautious, like she wasn't sure if I was coming in peace or ready for another fight. "How was it?" she asked hesitantly. "The therapy?" "It was, a lot," I admitted. I didn't offer more, and she didn't push. Instead, she nodded and went back to folding a blanket, giving me space. It was a small gesture, but I appreciated it. The next few days were quiet. We fell into a routine of polite cohabitation, sharing meals, talking about the kids, but avoiding the deeper conversations that loomed between us. It was easier that way, but it also felt like we were delaying the inevitable. I spent a lot of time thinking about Dr. Keller's question. What did I want? Some days, I thought I wanted to try again with Sarah, to find a way to rebuild what we'd lost. Other days, I couldn't imagine ever looking at her the same way again, let alone trusting her. The uncertainty was exhausting, but I knew rushing a decision wouldn't help. One evening, after the kids were asleep, Sarah approached me in the kitchen. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, gesturing for her to sit at the table. She sat across from me, wringing her hands nervously. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she began. "About needing more than words. And I realized. I haven't really done anything to show you I'm serious about making this right." Her words hung in the air, and I waited for her to continue. "I've been looking into therapists for myself," she said. "I know I need to figure out why I did what I did and how to fix the parts of me that let it happen. I deleted his number. Blocked him on everything. I want you to know that it's over. Completely." Hearing her say that brought a strange mix of relief and bitterness. Relief that she was cutting ties, but bitterness that she hadn't done it sooner. "I appreciate that," I said cautiously. "But it's going to take more than blocking his number for me to trust you again, Sarah." "I know," she said quickly. "I don't expect you to trust me right away. I want to take the steps, no matter how small, to show you that I'm all in." We sat in silence for a while after that. I could see how hard she was trying, but I also knew it wasn't just about her effort. It was about whether or not I could let go of the anger and betrayal enough to even consider rebuilding. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something important. No matter how much Sarah wanted to fix things, I had to want it too. And right now, I wasn't sure if I did. I still didn't know what I wanted, but I was starting to understand that I couldn't force an answer before I was ready. The unknown was terrifying. But for the first time, I started to see it as an opportunity, not just to decide the future of my marriage, but to figure out who I was outside of it. For years, I defined myself as Sarah's husband, as a father, as the provider. Maybe it was time to redefine myself, not for anyone else, but for me. The realization that I needed to focus on myself was liberating, but it was also terrifying. For years, my life had revolved around being a husband and father. Now, with my marriage hanging by a thread, I was forced to ask questions I hadn't dared to before. Who am I? What do I want? The answers didn't come easily, but I knew I couldn't find them sitting around in the shadow of my pain. I started small. The first thing I did was get back into the gym. I'd been a regular there years ago, but as life got busier, I'd let it slide. Now, it felt like the perfect place to channel all the emotions I didn't know how to process: anger, frustration, sadness. The first workout was brutal. I was out of shape, and every muscle in my body protested, but for the first time in weeks, I felt alive. The weights didn't judge me, and the burn in my arms and legs was a welcome distraction from the ache in my chest. The gym became my sanctuary. I'd wake up early, before the kids were even stirring, and head out for an hour or two. At first, I kept to myself, headphones in, focusing solely on the exercises. But as the weeks went by, I started to notice the same faces showing up day after day, people nodding in quiet acknowledgement, a sense of unspoken camaraderie building among us. It wasn't long before I struck up a conversation with Naomi, one of the trainers who was always quick with a smile and a word of encouragement. "You're doing great," she said one morning as I finished a set of squats, sweat dripping down my face. "Your form's way better than when you started." I laughed, surprised by the compliment. "Thanks. I feel like I'm just trying not to collapse half the time." Naomi grinned. "That's how it starts. But you've been consistent, and that's more than most people can say. Keep it up, and you'll surprise yourself." Her words stuck with me. For so long, I'd felt powerless, like my life was spiraling out of control. But in the gym, I was starting to reclaim a piece of myself. Every weight I lifted, every mile I ran, felt like a step toward something new, something that belonged to me and me alone. Outside of the gym, I made other changes too. I started journaling, a habit I hadn't touched since college. At first, it felt awkward, like I was just dumping my thoughts onto the page without any real direction. But over time, it became a space where I could be brutally honest with myself. I wrote about my anger at Sarah, my guilt over not seeing the signs, my fears for the future, and even the small moments of progress I was starting to see. Putting it all down on paper helped me make sense of the chaos in my head. The kids were another anchor. I threw myself into being present for them, taking them to the park, helping with homework, reading bedtime stories. They didn't know the details of what was happening between me and Sarah, but their innocence was a constant reminder of what mattered most. No matter what happened to my marriage, I was determined to be the best father I could be. Sarah noticed the changes, of course. I'd catch her watching me sometimes, a mixture of curiosity and sadness in her eyes. She didn't say much, but I could tell she was trying to give me the space I'd asked for. It was a strange dynamic. We were still living under the same roof, co-parenting and sharing meals, but there was a distance between us that neither of us knew how to bridge. One night, as I was tucking the kids into bed, my daughter looked up at me and said, "Daddy, you seem happier lately." Her words stopped me in my tracks. I hadn't thought about it that way, but she was right. Despite everything, I was starting to feel lighter, more like myself. I hugged her tightly and kissed her forehead. "Thanks, sweetheart. That means a lot to me." Later that night, I sat on the porch with a beer, staring up at the stars. I still didn't have all the answers. I didn't know if my marriage could be saved, or even if I wanted to save it. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. And that felt like a victory. Things had settled into a strange rhythm. Sarah and I were polite but distant, navigating life like co-workers who happened to share a home. I was focusing on myself, on the gym, the kids, my mental health, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of stability. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was close enough. Then something shifted. It started one evening when Sarah approached me while I was cleaning up after dinner. She had that look in her eyes, the one that told me she'd been working up the courage to say something. I braced myself, unsure if I had the energy for another heavy conversation. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked, her voice tentative. I nodded, drying my hands on a dish towel. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, then said, "I've been seeing a therapist." That caught me off guard. She hadn't mentioned it before, and part of me wondered if it was just another attempt to win points. But her tone was sincere, and there was something different about the way she carried herself, less defensive, more vulnerable. "I didn't want to tell you right away because I needed to do it for me, not to prove anything to you," she continued. "But it's been eye-opening. It's made me realize how much I've hurt you and how much work I need to do on myself." I leaned against the counter, studying her face. For once, she didn't look like she was trying to explain away her actions or justify what she'd done. She looked honest. "What made you decide to go?" I asked. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "You did," she said. "Seeing how hard you've been working on yourself, even after everything I put you through, made me realize I can't just sit here and expect things to fix themselves. I have to take responsibility for my part in this." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to acknowledge her effort, but another part of me was wary. Words were easy. Actions were harder. And trust? That was the hardest of all. "I'm glad you're doing the work," I said carefully. "But I need you to understand that this doesn't change things overnight. I'm still figuring out what I want, and I can't make any promises." "I know," she said quickly. "And I'm not expecting anything. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying." She left me alone after that, giving me space to process. As much as I wanted to be cynical, I couldn't ignore the small sliver of hope that crept in. Maybe this was the start of something real, something that could eventually lead to healing, whether together or apart. Over the next few weeks, Sarah continued to surprise me. She started spending more time with the kids, really engaging with them in a way I hadn't seen in years. She also began taking on more around the house without being asked, as if she was trying to shoulder her share of the emotional load. None of it erased the past, but it felt genuine, like she was finally trying to be the person I'd once fallen in love with. One evening, she came home with a small notebook and handed it to me. "What's this?" I asked, flipping through the pages. "It's a journal," she said softly. "My therapist suggested I start writing down my thoughts, about what I did, why I did it, and how I'm working to be better. I don't expect you to read it, but, if you ever want to, it's there." I was stunned. The Sarah I knew hated being vulnerable, especially when it came to admitting fault. This gesture was more than an apology, it was an invitation to see the messy, unfiltered version of her, the one she usually kept hidden. "Thank you," I said after a long pause. I didn't open the journal right away, but just knowing it was there meant something. That night, as I sat alone on the couch, I thought about how far we'd come since that first explosive confrontation. We weren't anywhere close to fixed, if such a thing was even possible, but there was a shift, a slow thawing of the ice between us. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward. I wasn't sure where that path would lead, but I knew one thing, I wasn't walking it alone anymore. Rebuilding trust is like crossing a fragile bridge. With every step, there's the fear that the next plank might break, plunging you into the abyss below. That's how it felt with Sarah. Each day brought a mix of cautious optimism and lingering doubt. I wasn't sure if the bridge we were building would hold, but we were finally moving toward each other instead of standing still. One evening, about a month after Sarah handed me her journal, she surprised me again. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when she walked in, holding 2 cups of tea. She set one down in front of me and sat across the table, her hands wrapped around her own mug like it was an anchor. "I was wondering if you'd like to go through the journal with me," she said, her voice hesitant. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I think it might help if we talked about what's in there, if you're ready." I stared at her for a moment, surprised by her bravery. Reading her journal had always felt like stepping into dangerous territory, a place where raw emotions and painful truths lived. But hearing her offer to share it with me, to make it a conversation instead of a monologue, felt like a step towards something real. "Okay," I said finally. "Let's do it." She gave me a small, nervous smile, and for the first time in months, I saw a glimpse of the Sarah I'd fallen in love with, the Sarah who wasn't afraid to face hard things head-on. We started that night. Sitting together on the couch, she opened the journal and began reading aloud. Her voice trembled at first, but as she went on, she grew steadier. The entries detailed everything, her growing unhappiness, her confusion, the guilt she felt even as she kept making choices she knew were wrong. She didn't shy away from the ugly parts, and as much as it hurt to hear, I respected her for it. One entry in particular stuck with me. She wrote about the first time she realized how much damage she was doing, not just to me, but to herself. "I remember looking in the mirror one morning," she read, her voice soft, "and I didn't recognize myself. I didn't see the woman who had vowed to love and cherish someone for the rest of her life. I saw a coward. Someone too scared to face her own unhappiness, who chose the easy, selfish path instead of being honest. I hated myself for it, but instead of stopping, I let it spiral. I told myself I'd already ruined everything, so why bother trying to fix it?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Hearing her admit the depth of her self-destruction didn't erase the pain she'd caused me, but it gave me a window into her mind, a chance to understand how she'd gotten to this point. When she finished reading, she looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "I don't expect you to forgive me for any of this," she said. "But I need you to know that I'm trying to forgive myself. Because if I don't, I'll never be able to be the person you or the kids deserve." I didn't know what to say. My emotions were a tangled mess of anger, empathy, and cautious hope. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before taking her hand. "Thank you for sharing this with me," I said quietly. "It doesn't fix everything, but it means a lot that you're willing to be honest." That night was a turning point. It didn't magically erase the betrayal or the hurt, but it opened the door to something we hadn't had in a long time, real communication. For the first time, I felt like we were truly seeing each other, not as the versions of ourselves we pretended to be, but as the flawed, vulnerable people we really were. Over the next few weeks, we continued to have these conversations. They weren't always easy, and some nights ended in tears or silence. But each time, we took another step across that fragile bridge, testing its strength, hoping it would hold. The hardest part was allowing myself to trust her, even in small ways. There were moments when the fear crept back in, when I'd see her on her phone or hear her mention work, and my mind would spiral. But I reminded myself that trust wasn't a switch you could flip on or off. It was a process, and we were just beginning. One day, as we sat together watching the kids play in the yard, Sarah turned to me. "Do you think we'll make it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer right away. I watched our daughter chase her brother across the grass, their laughter filling the air, and I thought about how far we'd come, and how far we still had to go. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I think we're starting to figure out how to try. And that's something." She nodded, her eyes shining with tears she didn't let fall. "That's enough for me." For now, it was enough for me too. The hardest part of rebuilding a broken relationship isn't the conversations or the apologies, it's the moments in between. The quiet, everyday moments where doubt creeps in, where trust feels like a distant memory, and where you're forced to decide, over and over again, whether you're willing to keep trying. That's where Sarah and I were now, navigating the in-between. After our talks about her journal, we started to actively work on repairing the damage. It wasn't just about apologies anymore, it was about actions. Sarah suggested we try couples therapy, and as hesitant as I was at first, I agreed. If there was any chance of us moving forward, we needed someone to help us untangle the mess we'd created. Our first session with the therapist, Dr. Monroe, was brutally honest. She didn't sugarcoat anything, and she made it clear from the start that rebuilding trust wasn't about quick fixes. "You need to understand," she said, looking at both of us, "that this is going to be uncomfortable. It's going to hurt. But the only way through it is to face the pain head-on." Sarah nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I just took a deep breath and braced myself. Dr. Monroe had us talk about our expectations for the process. What did we want from therapy? What were we afraid of? For me, the fear was simple. I was terrified that I'd never be able to trust Sarah again, that no matter how hard we worked, the cracks would always be there. For Sarah, the fear was more complex. She worried that I'd never see her as more than the person who betrayed me, that her mistakes would define her in my eyes forever. The sessions were grueling. We rehashed the affair, the lies, the moments where our marriage had started to crumble long before the betrayal. Sarah opened up about her insecurities, her feelings of inadequacy as a wife and mother, and how those feelings had led her to seek validation elsewhere. Hearing her admit those things was painful, but it also gave me a new perspective. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it helped me understand that her actions weren't about me, they were about her own unresolved issues. Dr. Monroe also made me confront my role in the breakdown of our marriage. That was a bitter pill to swallow. It was easier to focus on Sarah's mistakes, but the truth was, I hadn't been a perfect partner either. I'd let the grind of daily life consume me, neglecting the small acts of connection that keep a marriage alive. I'd taken Sarah for granted, assuming she'd always be there, even as we drifted further apart. Acknowledging my own shortcomings didn't absolve her of responsibility, but it reminded me that the cracks in our foundation hadn't appeared overnight, and they weren't hers alone to repair. Outside of therapy, we started making small changes. Sarah suggested we set aside one night a week as our time, no phones, no distractions, just us. At first, it felt awkward, like we were trying to force a connection that used to come naturally. But over time, those evenings became something I looked forward to, a chance to talk, to laugh, to remember why we'd fallen in love in the first place. I also started to notice changes in Sarah. She was more present, more engaged, not just with me but with the kids and even herself. She'd started reading again, something she used to love but had abandoned years ago. She seemed lighter, more at peace with herself, and it was hard not to feel hopeful when I saw that. One night, as we were sitting on the porch after putting the kids to bed, Sarah turned to me. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice tentative. "Of course," I said. "Do you think we're getting better?" she asked. "Like, really better? Or are we just pretending?" Her question caught me off guard, but I appreciated her honesty. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "I think we're trying," I said finally. "And trying is better than pretending." She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'll take that." The truth was, I didn't know if we were getting better. But what I did know was that we were both showing up, every day, and that mattered. We weren't the same people we'd been before the betrayal, and our marriage wasn't the same either. But maybe that was okay. Maybe we could build something new, something stronger. Rebuilding the foundation was slow, painstaking work. Some days felt like progress, others felt like setbacks. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on the same team, working toward the same goal. And for now, that was enough. Rebuilding a relationship isn't about grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It's about the small victories, the quiet moments that remind you why you're fighting to stay. Over the next few weeks, those moments started to show up in our lives, unexpected but welcome, like sunlight breaking through a stormy sky. One evening, we were in the kitchen after putting the kids to bed. I was rinsing dishes, and Sarah was wiping down the counters. It was an unremarkable moment, the kind of thing we'd done together 1,000 times before. But then she paused and looked over at me. "Remember when we first moved in here?" she asked, a small smile on her face. We stayed up all night painting the living room because we couldn't agree on a color, and then we ended up with beige anyway. I laughed, surprised by the memory. Yeah, and we were so tired the next day we could barely move. You swore you'd never paint a wall again. She smiled softly. I don't think I've thought about that in years. Neither had I, but the memory brought a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. It was the first time in months that we'd reminisced about something good, something that reminded us of who we used to be together. It wasn't much, but it felt like a step forward. There were other moments too, small acts of kindness that felt genuine, not forced. One morning, I woke up to find my favorite coffee waiting for me on the counter, a sticky note attached that read, "You've been working so hard. I see it, and I appreciate you." Another day, I noticed Sarah spending extra time with the kids, helping them with a school project and laughing in a way that reminded me of the woman I'd fallen in love with. One of the most surprising victories came during one of our no-phone evenings. We'd been playing a board game with the kids when Sarah suddenly burst out laughing at something silly our son had said. It wasn't just a polite laugh or a reserved smile, it was the kind of full, unrestrained laughter I hadn't seen from her in years. It caught me off guard, and for a moment, I just sat there, watching her. It was a glimpse of the person she used to be, the person I hoped she could be again. In therapy, Dr. Monroe encouraged us to celebrate these moments, no matter how small. Rebuilding trust and intimacy doesn't happen all at once, she said. It's about creating new memories, new connections, and showing up for each other in the little things. It wasn't easy, though. For every small victory, there were still moments of doubt and fear. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself wondering if this was all temporary, if Sarah was only putting in the effort because she felt guilty, or if I was only staying because I was afraid of starting over. Those thoughts didn't go away overnight, but I learned to push through them, to focus on the present instead of letting my mind spiral. One evening, after the kids were asleep, Sarah and I sat on the couch together, flipping through old photo albums. It started as a way to fill the silence, but it quickly turned into something more. We laughed at our awkward wedding photos, reminisced about our first family vacation, and even shared a few tears as we looked at pictures of the kids as babies. I miss this, she said quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of a photo. Not just the memories, but the way we were. The way we looked at each other. I nodded, my throat tight. I do too. There was a long pause before she spoke again. Do you think we can get back there? I thought about it, really thought about it, before answering. I don't think we'll ever be exactly who we were, I said honestly. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe we can be something better. Stronger. She reached for my hand, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel awkward or forced. It felt natural. These small victories didn't mean the work was done, or that everything was magically fixed. But they reminded me that progress was possible, that the cracks in our foundation didn't have to define us forever. For the first time in a long time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to rebuild, not the life we had before, but a new one, together. The small victories gave me hope, but hope wasn't enough to erase the lingering uncertainty. Trust is fragile, and every step forward felt like walking on thin ice, testing its strength with every movement. Still, we kept going, unsure of where this road would lead but unwilling to turn back. One of the hardest parts of testing the waters was letting myself believe that Sarah's changes were real. For months, I'd watched her go through the motions of being a better partner, therapy, more time with the kids, open communication, but there was always that nagging voice in the back of my head, what if this is temporary? What if she's just doing this because she feels guilty? I brought these fears to Dr. Monroe during one of our solo sessions. How do I know this isn't just damage control? I asked. How do I know she won't go back to who she was before? Dr. Monroe smiled gently. You don't, she said. That's the nature of trust, it's a leap of faith. But what you can do is look for consistency. Patterns of behavior tell you more than words ever could. Has she been consistent in her actions? I thought about it. The truth was, she had. Sarah wasn't just saying the right things, she was doing them. She was showing up for me, for the kids, and for herself in ways she hadn't before. And while that didn't erase the past, it made me believe that maybe, just maybe, this time was different. Testing the waters also meant reconnecting with her in ways that felt unfamiliar but necessary. One evening, Sarah asked if I'd like to go out for dinner, just the two of us. It was the first time we'd considered anything resembling a date since everything had come crashing down, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it. Do you think we're ready for that? I asked, my tone more cautious than dismissive. I don't know, she admitted. But I think it's worth trying. No pressure. Just a chance to see where we are. After some hesitation, I agreed. That Friday, we hired a babysitter for the kids and went to a small Italian restaurant we used to frequent years ago. Walking in felt surreal, like stepping into a time machine. The candlelit tables, the soft hum of conversation, the familiar scent of garlic and herbs, it all brought back memories of who we used to be. The conversation started off awkward. We talked about the kids, work, and other surface-level topics, neither of us wanting to dig too deep. But as the evening went on, something shifted. We started laughing, really laughing, about silly memories and inside jokes we hadn't shared in years. For a few hours, it felt like we were two people rediscovering each other, not just a husband and wife trying to repair what was broken. At one point, Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. I know this doesn't fix everything, she said, her voice soft but steady. But it means a lot to me that you're here. That you're willing to try. I looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't see the woman who had hurt me, I saw the woman who was trying to be better. It means a lot to me too, I said. And for the first time, I meant it. The night didn't erase the pain or the doubts, but it was a step forward, a chance to see if we could rebuild something new. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Testing the waters also meant letting Sarah back into my emotional space, little by little. There were times when it was hard, when I'd catch myself overthinking her every word or action, wondering if it was genuine. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to notice a shift in myself too. I was no longer holding on to the anger as tightly as I had before. It was still there, but it wasn't consuming me like it used to. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Sarah leaned her head on my shoulder. It was such a simple gesture, but it caught me off guard. For a moment, I froze, unsure of how to respond. But then I let myself relax and leaned into the moment. It wasn't much, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Rebuilding trust is messy, imperfect work. There were still days when the doubts crept in, when the pain felt fresh again, and I questioned whether we were doing the right thing. But there were also days when the waters felt calm, when the laughter came easily, and I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, we were on the path to something better. As the weeks turned into months, something unexpected began to happen. The walls I had built so carefully around my heart started to lower, not all at once, but brick by brick. What Sarah and I were rebuilding wasn't a replica of the love we once had, it was something entirely new. It wasn't effortless or innocent like before, it was raw, scarred, and forged through the fire of everything we'd been through. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Sarah and I sat on the porch, sipping wine and watching the stars. The night was quiet except for the soft hum of crickets, and for once, it felt peaceful instead of tense. She turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think you'll ever love me the same way again?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, heavy with vulnerability. I took a deep breath before answering. "No," I said honestly. "I don't think I'll ever love you the same way." Her face fell, but I wasn't finished. "I think that love is gone," I continued, setting my glass down and meeting her eyes. "But what I'm starting to feel now, it's different. It's not blind like it was before. It's not based on the idea of who I thought you were or who I thought we were supposed to be. It's real. It's flawed, and it's messy, but it feels honest. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she smiled, a real, genuine smile. That's all I want, she said softly. Something real. Something honest. That night marked a turning point for us. It wasn't just about repairing the damage anymore, it was about learning how to love each other as the people we were now, not the people we used to be. We weren't the same, and neither was our relationship, but maybe that was okay. Maybe it was even better. We started finding joy in the little things again. Cooking dinner together, laughing over shared memories, sneaking kisses in the kitchen like we used to. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when the past reared its ugly head, an old wound reopening, a stray thought that brought back the pain. But we didn't avoid those moments anymore. We faced them together, talked through them, and slowly began to heal. One afternoon, Sarah came home with a small, wrapped box. "I saw this and thought of you," she said, handing it to me with a nervous smile. I opened it to find a leather-bound journal, similar to the one she'd been using for therapy. Inside, she'd written a note. "For the next chapter of your story, whatever it may be. Thank you for giving us a chance to write it together." I ran my fingers over the pages, struck by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. It wasn't about the journal itself, it was about what it represented. It was her way of saying that she saw me, not just as her husband, but as a person with his own struggles, dreams, and journey. "Thank you," I said, pulling her into a hug. "This means a lot." "So do you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The new love we were building wasn't perfect. It didn't erase the past, and it didn't guarantee the future. But it was real. It was grounded in honesty, in shared effort, and in the understanding that we were both flawed humans doing the best we could. Some nights, I still found myself lying awake, thinking about everything that had happened and wondering what the future would hold. But when I looked over at Sarah, sleeping peacefully beside me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. We weren't back to where we used to be, and I wasn't sure we ever would be. But maybe that was the point. Maybe this wasn't about going back, it was about moving forward, together, into something new. Closure isn't something you find, it's something you build. That's what I've learned. It doesn't come neatly packaged in a final conversation or a single moment of clarity. It's a slow process of accepting what happened, learning from it, and choosing to let go, not of the memories, but of the pain they carry. Months after Sarah's affair came to light, our lives were beginning to feel stable again. Not perfect, not unscarred, but stable. Trust, once shattered, was slowly being rebuilt, one act of honesty at a time. Sarah had stayed true to her word, continuing therapy, being present, and showing me through her actions that she was committed to the hard work of rebuilding. And I had done the same, learning to trust myself again and making peace with the things I couldn't control. The biggest step toward closure came on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. I'd been clearing out the garage when I stumbled across a box of old photos and keepsakes. Among them was a picture of Sarah and me on our wedding day. We looked so young, so carefree, smiling like nothing in the world could touch us. I stared at it for a long time, my emotions a mix of nostalgia and sadness. Later that evening, I showed Sarah the photo. She held it in her hands, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. We had no idea what we were getting into, did we? I said finally, a faint smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. She shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "No," she said softly. "But we had so much hope. I think that's what got us through, even when things fell apart." Her words stayed with me. Hope. It had been the thread holding us together through the hardest times, the belief that, no matter how broken things seemed, we could find a way to heal. That night, after the kids were asleep, we sat together on the couch, revisiting the memories in the box. We laughed at our awkward honeymoon photos, teared up at pictures of the kids as babies, and even shared a few bittersweet smiles at reminders of the life we'd built together. It wasn't about pretending the bad stuff hadn't happened, it was about remembering that there was good, too. A lot of it. Eventually, Sarah looked at me and said, "I'm proud of us." "Me too," I said. And for the first time, I meant it. Closure didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean the pain was gone or that the scars had vanished. It meant accepting that the scars were part of our story, not the whole of it. It meant choosing to focus on the growth that had come from the pain, rather than the pain itself. As for growth, I felt it in myself every day. The gym, therapy, journaling, all of it had helped me rediscover parts of myself I'd lost along the way. I'd learned to stop seeking validation from others and instead find it within. I was stronger, more grounded, and more sure of who I was than I'd ever been. Sarah had grown too. She'd taken responsibility for her actions and worked hard to rebuild not just my trust but her own sense of self-worth. She was more open, more patient, and more willing to show vulnerability than she'd ever been before. Our relationship wasn't the same as it had been before the affair, it couldn't be. But it was stronger in a way I hadn't expected. It was rooted in honesty, in shared effort, and in the knowledge that we'd faced our worst moments and come out the other side. If I could give advice to anyone in a similar situation, it would be this: healing takes time. It takes effort, patience, and a willingness to face the hard truths about yourself and your relationship. It's not about erasing the past but about choosing how you move forward from it. And above all, it's about knowing your worth, whether that means rebuilding together or walking away to rebuild on your own. For Sarah and me, it meant starting fresh. Not from where we'd been, but from where we were now. It wasn't a happy ending, exactly, life doesn't work that way. But it was a hopeful one, and maybe that's even better. Because this time, it was real.